Businesses in Africa are not as risky as people say they are. The problem is risk. But what is risk? Risk is measured in two ways: actual risk and perceived risk. This video, I'm going to give you 2 tips that you can use to navigate risk and better raise funding and investment for your SME as you grow. So let's first look at what risk is. So these 2 categories, actual risk and perceived risks, are quite different. It's usually about what is known and what's unknown. Actual risk refers to the actual risk, the real risk that your business faces. This is often measured through some sort of risk register, which your organization keeps to measure where your risk is, the exposure to the risk, and mitigation strategies to help to overcome that risk in the actual day-to-day business. Perceived risk is the risk that's sort of made up or imagined by the investor or funder, which is not actually true, but perceived, usually based on the unknown. Information that this funder and investor does not know about the organization or may perceive based on past stories they've heard from others about the setting that this organization operates in. Sadly, there's a lot of sort of negative stories that investors might hear about settings that they're not involved in. Corruption stories, stories of war that's happened over 20 years ago or 30 years ago, whatever it is, that puts a barrier up that makes it difficult for them to invest in these businesses. That's perceived risk. And that's what a lot of the organizations across Africa are facing. High levels of perceived risks that makes it difficult to absorb funding and investment just because of unknown information that these investors don't have. So how do we overcome that? 2 techniques. The first one is where you have concessional funding or relationships with credible funders, whether that be grant funding or you've joined an accelerator program. Your job is then to strategically engage with investors and funders that's aligned with that investment program that you're part of. So if you've got a grant funding from the UK government, for instance, you want to engage with investors in the UK, because they would recognize the UK government as a credible partner. And if they're investing in your organization, the level of perceived risk that investor starts with is lower than if you didn't have that funding in place. So that's a strategic move. Rather than having to look for more funding and different pots of funding, instead utilize what you have. And where there's a funding in place that, or an accelerator program or some sort of support network that you're part of, utilize the investors that recognize that support network as a credible entry point. Number 2, look at funders and investors that have a lower level of perceived risk. And that's difficult because perceived risk is subjective. But what you do have is categories of investors and funders that have a slight level more familiarity with a setting, and therefore their information asymmetry will be lower, such as diaspora investors. Diaspora investors are, we're not saying the diaspora understand the systems and ins and outs, but we're saying instead that the diaspora investors perhaps have a higher level of exposure to the relevance of the business that you're doing in the setting that you're serving because of their familiarity with that setting. So it's important to be able to strategically find investors that have this lower level of perceived risk based on their familiarity. Being able to approach investors like diaspora investors and those that understand the operational environment and the relevance of what you're doing has a better starting point than perhaps just going out and approaching an investor that works in a sector. So for instance, if you're operating an energy organization in East Africa, the investors that you're approaching, if they're just energy organizations, they might not understand East Africa. And yes, part of your job is to help them to better understand it. But it might be easier to approach an investor that understands East Africa and the relevance of what you're doing, that has a lower level of perceived risk. So it's not just about approaching investors that have a sector understanding, but you want to find the ones that have the lowest level of information asymmetry so you can have a productive conversation and then allow for them to be a part of that journey with you. So on this journey, as you're fundraising and growing your organization, remember, it's about risk allocation. What we're saying here is different funders and different investors have different levels of risk, and you need to be able to strategically see where their risk level is and find those that are going to have the lowest level of perceived risk. So rather than knocking on 100 doors of investors, instead strategically try to find those that have the lowest level of perceived risk, and those are the ones that are going to be the productive investors for you.